Thank you very much for that introduction. As was said, my name is Alex. I'm a second-year economics PhD student at the University of Leeds, which means I spend the large majority of my time staring blankly at the screen and banging my head against a wall. Whilst that is a thrilling part of my day-to-day life, I'm sort of doing some what I think is really interesting research into climate finance justice. And I'm going to talk to you guys today about a little portion of that. So over the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to start by outlining what justice currently means in respect to climate finance. So climate finance being the transfer of funds from developed countries such as the US, the UK, etc., to developing ones. So for example, Ethiopia, Indonesia, to enable them to meet their mitigation and adaptation targets. I'm then going to go on to highlight some of the problems with those ideas of justice. And then as a way of trying to resolve that, I'm going to consider what justice is in a more abstract sense, and then try and apply these conclusions to the case of climate finance. So the problem. In 2015, key climate actors, so over 150 different nation states, signed up, ratified the Paris Agreement. And as part of the Paris Agreement, they agreed to the goal of jointly mobilizing $100 billion a year by 2020 to address the needs of developing states. How are they to do this? So the Paris Agreement outlines many ways of reaching this total, stating that states should mobilize climate finance from a wide variety of sources, instruments, and channels. And as with many things we see, there goes through climate finance has gone through lots of different cycles, sort of from the early 90s. And currently the most in vogue is private finance. So in opposition to sort of public finance, that is finance coming from nation states, either directly, so from the donor state to the recipient state, or indirectly through things such as multilateral organisations such as multilateral development banks, sort of IMF funds, and private finance, on the other hand, is from investment funds, businesses who may want to invest in something in order to maximise their profits, or for reputational reasons. But unfortunately, this goal has not been met, and in itself is not sufficient. So why has the pledge not been met? So the amounts and means by which this 100 billion is to be motivated has been left intentionally vague. And this is very much the norm with international agreements, where there's a certain amount of woolliness. And this woolliness allows for lots of different states to ratify agreements, because there's a lot of flexibility in the interpretation. So there's an international consensus, but the way the outcomes achieved are not sort of put down in stone, for example. And there's also the issue with international agreements, that how do you enforce them? How can one state punish another? So, for example, if we think about maybe your rental agreement that you're currently signed up to. There's very clear terms. So you know that if you trash your room, for example, there will be a clear punishment. So you will be kicked out of that room, made to pay a fine, etc. You don't have that explicitness with international agreements such as these. So down to the second point, why is it not sufficient? So this $100 billion target was agreed in a shady back room back in 2009 by Hillary Clinton when she was then Secretary of State in the US, along with some other developing countries. So that means that it wasn't a participatory process. A lot of people weren't allowed to input. And also, more recently, research has shown that the 100 billion is insufficient to meet the needs of the developing state, especially as we see increasing temperature rises. The severity of change is that we need to be giving much more money to assist these states. So this leads us to a question. How should we meet the $100 billion a year target? So I was going to ask you guys to pop some things in the chat here, but I have not done a very good job of practicing and did not realise I would not be able to see the chat. So I'll sort of discuss this a little bit myself. So should is a very normative word. It describes not what is, but what ideally will be. So then we're kind of trying to look at what frameworks or what sort of aspirational target that we should be looking to use. So the one I'm very much interested in is the idea of justice. So what are the current framings of justice? So these, the current framing is at the international scale. So that is between different nation states. And here, two main concepts of justice are employed. Both of these are allocational, so they're ways of dividing the $100 billion pie. So if we think of it as a circle split into segments, we're looking at how large a segment is for any one state. So these two standards, the first is capacity-based. So this is based around the ability of these states to pay. So the extra money or resources the states have available to redistribute. So this is sort of needs-based redistribution. The second is responsibility-based, so looking at historic responsibility. So this is based on the historic carbon emissions of these states. So this is essentially paying damages based on their proportional contribution. And to put this into a little bit of context, rich countries such as the US, Canada, Japan, and a lot of Western Europe account for just 12% of the global population today, but are responsible for over 50% of all the planet's planet warming greenhouse gases released from things such as fossil fuels and industry over the past 170 years. Moreover, these states who have done the most damage often don't really feel the consequences. So then, what is the problem with the current framing? So there's very much a mismatch here. The Paris Agreement assigns responsibilities to states, so it lays out the 100 billion top-down target, but the way that nation states respond to this target is very individual. It's in accordance with their own capacities, I guess. And unfortunately, we find that these states reject international calls to justice. They are to take on such responsibility. It doesn't mean that they're not sort of contributing money, but they will not agree to paying back sort of some form of damages, for example. And this is quite worrying because these developed states hold a lot of the global power. So what we need to be thinking about is how can ideas of justice be used to encourage climate finance. And that leads us on to consideration of what is justice. So justice is very much a social contract. This means what is considered just changes over time in accordance with prevailing social norms. It depends on how you view the world. So what one person thinks is just doesn't necessarily mean another person does. So I'm going to try and illustrate this with our friendly neighborhood Batman. So if we think of Batman and his nemesis, Poison Ivy, both are sort of trying to enforce their own visions of justice. Batman more closely aligns with the social norms, so protecting the weak and innocent from the powerful and strong. Whereas Poison Ivy looks to protect endangered species and the natural environment from the careless actions of humans. So both consider what they're doing is just, but how that's realised are in very different ways. So next, justice is expressed differently at different scales. So there's a difference between what people do as an individual, so the local level as part of a group, for example, the national level, and then between countries, so looking at the global scale, and states, countries acting as geopolitical entities. So if we put this into terms of different academic disciplines, we could say that the local level, a person's actions is determined by their psychology. And then at a group level, it's determined in respect to their sociology, and then at a global level, their international relations. And while these three things are interlinked and feed back into each other, there's not a direct causal relationship. So things are expressed differently at different scales. So what one person thinks themselves doesn't necessarily mean that that's the same thoughts as the group, for example. As the actors, the people and parties change, so do the ideas of justice. So then, what do national ideas of climate justice look like? So different to the ideas of justice involving developed and developing states, we here argue that we need to look at the national scale. But who are the parties involved at this national level? So here we go to the historic idea of the social contract. And this was developed to answer the question, what motivates individuals to give up some of their freedoms? So before they were part of a state in whatever form, they were able to do whatever they wanted. There were no laws. So why did they choose to obey, to submit some of their free will to an authority, I guess? And we can see there's two dynamics going on here. So the sovereign provides protection to the citizen. So this protection, for example, could be in private property rights. For example, the citizen knows that the state will enforce any legal conditions. So if they, for example, were invaded by their neighbour who tried to take away their land, that neighbour would then be punished and the land be given back to them. So that allows people to plan for the future, and that allows us to build and develop an increasingly more complex society. And equally, the citizen provides legitimacy to the sovereign states. So, for example, in democratic states such as we live in the UK, by every year voting in the elections, citizens give the sovereign the authority to act by saying we support your policies. It allows them to carry on with what they're doing. There's not anarchy, for example. So we have the two actors. We have the sovereign and the citizen. So this is obviously quite a simple frame, but we're trying not to get too complex here. So we've talked about the different actors that we're looking at, and then we also need to think about at what period of climate finance those actors are operating. So a lot of what we've been discussing in the current framing occurs in the use phase of the climate finance. So this is when the money is given between donor state and recipient state, or the recipient state and its localities and its individuals. But what we're trying to do here is look at the production stage. So between the state and its citizens, the interactions between the state and the citizens in deciding what amount to give and in what form. So it's here that we're really saying that we need to focus. So just ending off now with a call to action. So is justice a useful concept if it is ignored? So I've tried to show through this talk that international ideas of justice are essentially not paid attention to. But then if we're looking at the national level, it seems like there's a much greater chance that we can create positive change. So we're reframing from the international to the national, and this allows us to take better care, more attention to the power dynamics that are operating, and also allows us to consider the feedback loops of climate change. So it's not a linear process. It's not what's happening in the developed. It's not what's happening remotely in developing states, and we're sort of providing aid, but more in not providing aid. There's sort of a feedback loop, which also results in environmental inequalities. For example, as we've seen with Ukraine, the global supply chains are very much interlinked, resulting in soaring costs of living. And if we don't pay attention to this, then we're going to see these consequences exacerbated. So thank you very much for listening. I think the take-home message for this is climate justice can only be achieved if we account for how those in power, so developing states, understand justice, and that is what my research goes on to do. Sorry, many thanks for listening. If you have any questions, I welcome them.
Thank you very much, Alex. That was great. Really, really interesting. Please use the chat function, everyone, if you would like to ask any questions or have any comments on Alex's work. I've got a quick question, Alex, if that's all right. I wondered if you'd come across much literature or research around how the legal definitions and framework for justice, how they relate or compare to personal and kind of socially constructed ideas of justice, and how that might vary in different places globally. I don't know if that is directly linked to the focus of your work on climate justice, but it struck me that in different places there could be differences in how each of those relate.
Yeah, so I guess the idea with international agreements is that the sort of terms agreed there will filter down into national legal law, I guess. And we have the Climate Change Act, for example, in the UK. But this is very much to do with reducing our emissions as opposed to providing support to developing states through climate finance. Climate finance has very much been grouped with overseas development aid, which is wrong because this finance is meant to sort of be new and additional, so something on top of that. So I guess in the literature, it's quite difficult because, as you're saying, as we sort of heard in the introduction, I guess it's quite an interdisciplinary topic, and I don't think there's too much of a examination on how international law maybe feeds down so much, because they would be sort of like looking at different subjects. But I haven't looked too much into this, so yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the comment.